If you want to know who is winning the global economic race in 2026, the standard scorecards are currently printing out contradictory results. Look at traditional metrics, and the United States maintains its position as the undisputed economic leader. This map visualization breaks down the raw top-line numbers. On the left, we see the U.S. nominal GDP standing at $30.6 trillion, casting a long shadow over China's $19.4 trillion on the right. But nominal GDP only counts dollars at exchange rates. Applying the alternative metric of purchasing power parity adjusts for price differences to measure actual physical command over resources. When toggling the data to that PPP basis, the entire picture flips. China abruptly overtakes the United States, pulling ahead by an $11.7 trillion margin. We are left with a massive structural paradox. The United States holds ultimate financial wealth and leads in frontier innovation, while China commands vastly more physical capacity and real-world goods. To accurately map this transition, we must look past the binary question of who's on top and analyze the specific asymmetries across macroeconomic trends, the technology deployment, and global trade, and the structural burdens weighing both nations down. The first vector we need to examine is the macroeconomic trajectory. In absolute terms, the United States still holds a 1.59 times multiplier over China's nominal economy. But because localized wages and material costs are significantly lower in China, Beijing can extract more concrete, steel, and manufactured goods for every single dollar spent. We can see this in real time on a dual-axis chart tracking current growth trajectories. While the absolute gap between economies narrows, China's growth vector accelerates to roughly 5.3%, crossing directly over a depressed U.S. line flattening out near 2.2%. That sluggish U.S. performance is driven largely by cooling consumer spending patterns across the domestic market. At the same time, massive new tariff policies have introduced severe supply chain uncertainties, creating a secondary drag that actively stifles long-term private investment. China's growth vector relies on a completely different engine, heavily bolstered by aggressive, targeted fiscal stimulus from the state. And despite facing steep U.S. trade barriers, Chinese manufacturing has maintained remarkable export strength. The data shows that at their current respective trajectories, China's economy is expanding nearly 2.5 times faster than America's. So, while the U.S. retains the absolute nominal crown, China's superior growth rate, combined with its vast purchasing power, means the macroeconomic gap between them is actively and measurably compressing. The second vector involves technology, where the race has diverged into two distinct models of development. The United States dominates the first category, frontier innovation. American companies currently own the architectures behind advanced generative AI and the massive cloud networks required to sustain them. The most visible physical manifestation of this American innovation lead is commercial spaceflight. U.S. aerospace companies, led heavily by SpaceX, now control approximately 90% of all global launch capacity. China is prioritizing a different model, the electrostate, focusing its resources on the massive physical deployment of next-generation infrastructure. You can see this mass market scale in the electric vehicle sector, where China currently commands 70% of all global production. Domestic manufacturers there have rapidly eclipsed their American competitors in both raw manufacturing volume and absolute consumer adoption rates. If we trace the supply chain down a level, China also controls 94% of the global production for lithium iron phosphate batteries, the specific technology driving the entire EV transition. And at the bedrock of this electrostate is physical resource extraction. China maintains an 80% chokehold over the processing of global rare earth elements. The United States is actively inventing the digital and orbital future, but China is systematically building the physical, earthly infrastructure required to power it. That physical supply chain dominance feeds directly into our third vector, trade dynamics and the geopolitical fallout of economic warfare. In 2025, the U.S. administration rolled out an aggressive 145% tariff regime aimed squarely at Chinese imports. The immediate measured result was a massive 19.5% collapse in Chinese goods flowing into the U.S. market. But this map illustrates China's strategic countermaneuver. Watch the thick trade route to the U.S. shrink, while multiple new flow lines instantly radiate outward from China, establishing deep, expanding trade channels into Vietnam, India, and Russia. This pivot makes Beijing highly resilient to American economic pressure, providing massive physical momentum to their Belt and Road Initiative, exporting concrete, steel, and transit systems to developing nations. As Chinese commercial ties expand outward, U.S. foreign aid has sharply contracted, dropping down to $28.5 billion. This economic withdrawal matches a growing political hesitation, marked by sudden delays in U.S. engagement regarding Taiwan's status and military aid. By erecting aggressive trade barriers, the United States inadvertently forced China to diversify its export markets, slowly draining American soft power across the global south. However, neither superpower operates in a vacuum. Our final vector tracks the severe internal crises threatening to destabilize both nations from the inside. For the United States, the primary threat is fiscal. The federal deficit is currently running at an unsustainable 6.3% of GDP. That translates to roughly $2 trillion in annual shortfalls, draining capital markets, pushing up borrowing costs, and crowding out technological investment. Compounding this debt is a secondary headwind, the severe inflationary pressure and systemic supply chain chaos directly resulting from the new tariff regime. But China's internal vulnerabilities are equally dangerous, beginning with the catastrophic collapse of its domestic real estate sector. Property development historically drove a staggering 30% of Chinese GDP. Its implosion has destroyed immense household wealth and severely dampened consumer spending. Look at how these crises balance out. On the left, U.S. fiscal deficits and tariff inflation crash down. On the right, China's wealth destruction is compounded by a terminal demographic crisis, a rapidly shrinking labor force mirroring Japan's stagnation in the 90s. Retaining long-term global power will not be determined solely by who can generate the most explosive growth, but by who can actually survive their own internal structural decay. We synthesize these four vectors on a single radar chart to visualize the geopolitical landscape. As the data points plot onto the grid, they form a complex polygon that heavily skews in opposite directions for each nation. There is no absolute victor here. The strict empirical data confirms that the United States is experiencing a measurable relative decline compared to China's rise. That decline is most heavily concentrated in physical infrastructure, supply chain leverage, and geopolitical soft power across emerging markets. Yet this is aggressively counterbalanced by America's ultimate fail-safes: unrivaled capital markets, unmatched nominal wealth, and absolute supremacy in the high-margin frontier technologies of tomorrow. The global system is witnessing a bifurcation, splitting into two highly specialized and deeply entrenched networks. Both nations are currently carrying massive structural burdens that strictly limit their capacity to achieve total unipolar hegemony. In the end, the ultimate global victor will be whichever nation manages to maintain its institutional coherence through the economic turbulence of the late 2020s.